The question I started with for this project was about the relationship between heavy and light TV watchers in small towns and those in large cities, and how those two factors could aid in the skewed perception of reality in emerging adults. These are people between the ages of 16 and 26. So I expected to find that the heavy TV watchers would ultimately have a gloomier outlook on society because they tended to watch more television, and the truth of it is that television tends to exploit the idea of violence because it's entertaining. And I expected that those who lived in larger cities would have a very similar outlook on society because the idea of resonance. This is the idea that whatever is going on outside their door is being reinforced by the violence that they're watching on television. However, I do have to admit that the answer that I got was not what I expected to get. It was not what I assumed would be the outlook, and that has a lot to do with what I discovered about cultivation theory. It's important to know that the Generation Y is also known as the consumer generation. This is a group of people that have spent their entire time buying what people are selling, and that includes television shows and movies. The other important piece is that TV shows and movies have altered how they tell stories because that's what people expect to see. They want more violence. Every year we have more body counts.
From the very beginning, people have no role other than as products who are attracted to a particular program, which in effect is the bait.
And boys and girls, for the very first time, we all started to eat Wonder Bread at all our meals, breakfast, lunch.
Those audiences are the audiences who are most likely to be the consumers of a particular kind of product.
America's best-selling, best-tasting filter cigarette. It still tastes good like a cigarette should.
And then the advertiser, in turn, pays for producing the program. From the very beginning, the public is what is bought and sold.
There's one for you, and there's one for you, Joan. It certainly was a fine first round. Well, you know, everybody's buying more and more.
Out of this comes an inescapable and highly pervasive cultural environment, now produced essentially to sell.
Brought to you by Coca-Cola.
For Gerbner, the commercial nature of this environment was fundamental.
Say it. When you call, I want you to say, I'm making a $1,000 vow of faith. Say the word $1,000. Say it.
Operating as businesses first, media corporations present a certain kind of world, a world built to sell, offering up a distinct brand of reality shaped by the demands of the marketplace. Everything else stems from this commercial logic, from the fundamental fact that private corporations decide what fills the public airwaves.
Today, a handful of global conglomerates own and control the telling of all the stories in the world. They have global marketing formulas that are imposed on the creative people in Hollywood, and I'm in touch with them, and they hate it. They say, don't talk to me about censorship from Washington. I never heard about that. I get censorship every day. I'm told, put in more action, cut out complicated solutions. They apply this formula because it travels well on the global market. These are formulas that need no translation, they're essentially image-driven, that speak action in any language, and of course the leading element of that formula is violence.
It was a sidewalk execution in Brooklyn, and a restaurant surveillance camera caught it all on tape.
This morning, there are fears that a possible serial killer is on the loose and will strike again.
The scars on 9-year-old Bowen Manning's face are still healing. There are close to 100 stitches holding him together after a pit bull attack.
So, having discovered the various things that I learned about cultivation theory, and that perhaps it's not so much about what people watch, that it's not about the violent television shows, and more so the way that they're being presented on television, I decided to put that theory to the test.
You always have to look over your shoulder. A lot of times you might feel uneasy if somebody's walking by you. You feel like you're always like on guard.
To get a handle on what Gerbner means by the mean world syndrome, it's not enough to analyze individual TV programs or films or video games. The entire media context is what matters. How one kind of story or program blends into another to create and reinforce a distinct view and sense of the world. Getting to the heart of the mean world syndrome, then, requires taking a look at TV the way most of us experience it at home, when we're not in classrooms thinking about these things, by simply picking up the remote and doing a little channel surfing. When we do, with every change of the channel, we're likely to see the most banal content, alternating with the most bizarre and violent and frightening, so that what would be shocking in our real lives in the media world comes to seem normal and mundane, reinforcing the sense that the world is a place of constant danger and threat.
I have to do what I can to protect myself and my children, and that's a fact of life, a way of life.
What cultivation analysis has done is to show how these kinds of anxieties and insecurities are caught up explicitly with media culture, uncovering a direct correlation between the amount of television one watches and the level of fear one has of being victimized.
If you look at it from a cultivation point of view, you see that the image of victimization, the image of risk, the image of danger, the conception that if there is so much violence in the world, I'm at risk. Not that I'm going to go down the street to be a mugger, but on the contrary, I'm afraid to go down the street at night. I'm afraid to go into the subways. I'm afraid of strangers. I try to cross the street when I see somebody that I think may be dangerous to me. These are the consequences of exposure to violence that are cultivated in large communities over long periods of time.
The finding that if you watch a lot of TV, you're likely to be more afraid of violence than those who watch less TV may help explain why so many people seem to think violent crime is far worse than it actually is. a widespread misperception that started to be noticed a decade ago when crime rates began to drop.
Here is the reality. Violent crime per capita actually dropped slightly in the latest figures released by the Justice Department. Nationwide, murder was down 5%.
But the perception continues to dominate reality, triggering a fear that is out of sync with statistics, a fear that no one and no place is safe anymore.
And when you're always on guard, it's hard to let go of fear, no matter what the reality.
And this classic example of the mean world syndrome continues today. In fact, since that ABC News report about falling crime rates, Justice Department figures show that violent crime has dropped an additional 43% to a remarkable 30-year low.
Anderson, the FBI says violent crime dropped 2.5% in 2008. Now, that includes an overall 4.4% decline in murders.
But despite the steady drop, polls have consistently shown that most Americans believe just the opposite to be true, that crime has actually been increasing.
3/4 of Americans say there is more crime in the United States than there was a year ago. Gallup's annual crime poll shows it's the highest level since the early 1990s. The poll also finds 51% of Americans say there is more crime in their local area than there was a year ago.
The logical question is why? Why do fear and anxiety about violence seem to be rising even when the threat of violence is falling? Well, surveys consistently show that upwards of 2/3 of the people who believe crime to be a very serious personal problem say they get most of their news from television. This is the breakthrough of cultivation analysis, a clear correlation between the amount of media we consume and the degree of fear and anxiety we have about the world.